when you start working on your storyboards, you can easily just, use a sketchbook, start drawing on a piece of paper, draw out some grid lines to make some frames and start filling in, or using post-it notes and just drawing a storyboard frame on each post-it note. You can also go online and find storyboard templates. So I would just Google this and find the template that you like the best. And you can either paint these online, bring them into Photoshop, or you can print them out and then draw them in person if that's what you're more comfortable with. There's also this free program called Storyboarder. And so it's a free painting program. It's pretty basic, but it has like a really helpful timeline so you can swap back and forth between your frames. And really great if you are interested in trying to do this digitally you could use a mouse, but you could also use a tablet, and you don't really want to dive into using something like Photoshop or a similar program might be a little bit more complex. So here I want to take a moment to show you a practical example of how you can approach storyboarding. So I personally am a digital artist, so I like to work in 3D, or I feel really comfortable working on a computer and working with like digital painting within Photoshop. So what I'm covering here is going to be based entirely in Photoshop. But of course, you could do this with pencil sketches as well. If you feel comfortable freehand sketching and drawing and you feel like you're a really strong artist, you can just do this on pieces of paper. Or if you want to kind of do some of this workflow, you could do it with traditional drawings as well, right? So you can scan your images, bring them in of your little character sketches, and then add some color and value to kind of um, help visually establish space and things like that. So I'm just going to kind of break this down a little bit to give you some context of how this is working. So usually I start with something like the ground. Um, so I'll usually, this is looks a little bit complex, but reality, it's pretty much like a value. We'll talk about grads in a second. A little grid image, and then I have a second grid image, probably just to show um, stronger lines. Not super necessary, really. We could just skip it to just this image right here. Right. So to do this, usually what I do is if I don't feel comfortable drawing out lines or perspective, there's a perspective tool. I don't think my version of Photoshop has it super well. Let's see where it is. So you can do something like this where you drop in a radial shape. So you just choose the shape option. And so I recommend if you guys want to look this up, just do quick perspective lines in Photoshop. It's not the technique I'm going to show you. But essentially what you do is you drop in this star shape and then you use that to create like two vanishing points or a single vanishing point, and that'll help you draw some shapes. What I like to do for a ground at least is I like to actually import or place an image that has a grid. So I just go to Google and I type in grid image, right? Something like this. I just grab a black and white image, go File, Import, or File Place. And then I'm going to just grab this from the Downloads folder. Let's find Quick Access Downloads. Okay. And so then what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and hit Enter. Let's go ahead and hide this other one. And then usually I like to not have just this checkerboard alpha background, so I'll just drop in like a flat layer, like 50% gray. I personally like to look at 50% gray. I'll take this and I'll set this to multiply, the blending mode for my grid. Now what I can do is I can come in here and use perspective or warp. Let's do warp or perspective. And what I can do is I can actually kind of create a ground plane to work from, right? So let's set this, pull this in. Right, and I can play around with perspective a bit. It's not perfect. It's not going to give you exactly what you need, but this can be a really cool tool to help you kind of create a ground plane to work with. So that's one way I would do it. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to shrink this down for a second. Maybe this will help me really get the perspective line. So grab this, say perspective, pull that out. I really want this to be pretty flat. And I'm going to collapse this. Enter. And so if you really want to get this to be more like a floor, it's interesting, that's not what I wanted. Let's go to my layers. Layers, okay. I'm just gonna rasterize this. So let's go ahead and see if this fixes it. I just want to shrink this down. So you can see if I bring these closer down it's going to feel more like it's flat, right? The more I'm looking at this, it feels more like the camera's up higher looking down, right? I'm just going to put something down here and go ahead, pull it so it feels a little bit flatter, and then scale this wide. So I'll just go ahead and grab here, and just so it takes up the whole space. I know there are other ways to do this, so please do a little digging if you find this workflow a little tedious. A lot of times I'll also define a horizon, right? Let's do that with like a paintbrush if I want to, or something else, or drop in like a line just to kind of help me understand where I am related to it, or to the ground. And I can do the same thing with this. I can just duplicate this and do Control T. Sorry, I haven't been mentioning my buttons, which I probably should do. And then I could drop in that same grid. And if you really want to like get like a wall or something like that, you could use this to kind of define like the side of a building or a wall. And you could use things like skew. Skew is kind of like perspective, but you can you have to get used to them to kind of understand what they're doing. But the transform tools. So I'm just grabbing the layer, pressing Control T, and right clicking to go to perspective or skew. And so that just gives me that ability to change that. And then what I'd come down here is I'd erase everything over here on this layer, maybe behind that. So maybe that's a wall that a character's interacting with. So you don't have to make it complicated. Something people also do is if you feel comfortable in a program like Google SketchUp, you can just mock up like squares and then draw over them, right? So there's a lot of different approaches, and it's the beauty of digital art. So now that I have a ground plane and just like a base value to start from, then I'm going to go ahead and start adding some visual contrast and value tricks to kind of help us draw our attention. So I'm going to drop in my character. So let's say I scanned the sketch, or I just went ahead and drew it in here, right? Which I did in this case. And so I just did a rough sketch of the character walking, right? And so I placed her, I scaled her in the space to make sense. Okay, so let's say she's going to be right here. I like to go ahead and give her a value to kind of make her stand out right now. So right now it's easy to stand out because there's not much else going on. But if I had all these grid lines behind her, or I had like a bunch of other pieces that I wanted to put in here, this would be a little visually confusing. So I just use like a quick paint. Oh, I did not scale those together. But I just did like a quick paint job where I just filled it in so you can see it's covering the grid lines. It also makes her stand out a bit, right? So she's like the brightest part in this image. And she also has the highest contrast, so she has black and white values, and so she's really popping. And so everything else kind of falls away. To help add some depth and dimension to this, right? This floor, you can see the lines help, but something else I like to do is use a gradient. So I'm actually going to hide this new grid I created. Where's that at? And we're going to bring in the old grid. Okay, so we had this grid. And so I just use a gradient with the gradient tool, right? And I just dragged a value so that when it's further away in space, it's darker, and when it's closer, it's brighter. And so you can see that kind of just further makes that floor feel a little bit more dimensional, where that sits back in space and this is forward in space. Okay. Then I added a little context in terms of like adding a little bit more depth cues of making foreground, midground, background objects. So I added, in this case, I have this crowd, right? So you can feel they're in the background. I could do something else, like let's say I'm going to actually take this, duplicate this. I'm just going to grab like a single part of this. Like I'll grab this guy. This guy who looks really confused. What? So I'll just do Control Shift J. Okay, I'll just go ahead and erase some things. Okay. Oops, I was doing it from the wrong one. So I'll do it from this one, erase. Okay, so let's say this is going to be a guy in the foreground, like, yeah, she's going to be walking up towards. So I'm going to move him up higher, and I need to make him kind of distinct in like in the space-wise. And let's go ahead. I'll just quickly edit this so this doesn't look super terrible. I'm just going to grab a different brush. Brushes, things like that, exactly what your workflow is, they're not important, right? What's important is just using the program and the package to get the job done quickly. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. I'll set the values. I'll do Control U to change the hue and saturation. Just to bring this darker a little bit. So I'm just kind of just trying to distinguish differences in space, right? So just value can really help me that. So this ground plane really helps, right? Because I can see where they're literally positioned, but also value. Just it doesn't necessarily have to be like lighter is closer, darker is further away, but just using value to make things look like they're clearly in separate areas. So I'm just using this. Let's bring this down a little bit darker. Okay. I'll move this character off to the side a little bit. And maybe I'll duplicate this. And I'll move one over here, right? So now I feel kind of like I have like foreground characters that she's walking towards, right? I could further do this with adding some depth of field, right? So what I might do is I might take these guys right here and I might go ahead and do filter blur, Gaussian blur, right? And so that's just going to make it feel like they're further back in space. And I can do the same thing with these guys. So I just grab them, go filter, blur, Gaussian blur. I'll just click Gaussian blur, right? So now it really feels like they're in different space depth planes, right? So because I made these guys blurred and these guys less blurred, right? They feel like they're in different spaces. And because she's the most in focus and everybody else is a little bit blurry, she also feels like she's in a different focal plane or different space. And I also like to add like a little gradient drop shadow, sometimes just show contact floor. And these are things that once you get used to them, they're really quick to do. Let's see what else. And I also just added, this is more for a compositional sake, is I just added a vignette gradient, right? So I just did like a radial gradient. So I just grab gradient tool, radial gradient, and then I just drop that in on the background on top of a lot of elements. And so that just kind of pulls our attention here. So you can see with all these value changes and these corrections that really when you look at this from far away, I know exactly what I'm supposed to be looking at, right? And so that's that whole concept of creating storyboards that are easy to read. I'm showing this to you. This does not mean this is what you guys have to do with storyboards. This is just to show you guys how you can kind of up your story level game to with digital art if you feel comfortable using something like Photoshop or another 3D painting program.